How would you communicate to someone older than you in your culture?
I would actually call them a variation of the word uncle, depending on how old they are relative to my parents. So for example, there's two words for uncle, it's and ua. So is for someone who's older than you, but also younger than your parents, and then ua is for someone who's older than you and older than your parents. And that also applies to the female gender too.
How would you communicate to someone a different gender than you in your culture?
So growing up in Indonesia, I was kind of taught like to it's just treat them equally. That's kind of the move now, I guess. Treat them all equally and don't really have any differences from just treating them. But the way I grew up, it's like you kind of treat, especially women, as, I guess, not really fragile, but with more respect and more sensitivity compared to males.
What's something that you think is unique about communication and etiquette in your culture?
We don't really have, grammatically, we don't have formal words to show, like when you're talking to someone older than you. It's just something that's been kind of improvised compared to like some languages where there's specific words that you say when you're talking to someone who's older than you. We don't have that. We don't say sir, we don't say ma'am or whatnot. We just kind of improvise it. Yeah, that's about it.
What are some things we do in America that would be offensive in your culture? What makes them offensive?
Being loud. Just being the loudest person in the room really isn't something that's considered to be good where I'm from. Because we're not very individualistic country, and just being like loud, brash, and just kind of thinking that you're the best or whatever, which is kind of the stereotype of Americans from other cultures, that they're loud and they make themselves known, like they make their presence known. That's not really something that's good in our culture. People that do that don't really get ahead, they kind of get left behind because we're all about not the individual but like the team. So yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
How would you communicate to someone older than you in your culture?
So in our culture, basically communicating with others, like in the language that I speak, which is Hindi, we usually use the word aap to communicate with someone older and tu to communicate with someone younger.
How would you communicate to someone a different gender than you in your culture?
Talking with other genders is basically the same as like how we do in America. So it's really not that different like how you would communicate with the same gender.
What's something that you think is unique about communication and etiquette in your culture?
We try to give respect to anyone who's older. So like anyone who's like older than you, you'll call like uncle or like basically give them respect and call them aap instead of calling them by their first name.
What are some things we do in America that would be offensive in your culture? What makes them offensive?
In India, we usually try to give respect to older people, and in America it is very common to call elders by their first names. While in India, if you would call someone like who's considerably older than you by their first name, or even their last name, and not put like an uncle or something in front of the name, that will be considered offensive. Because it is very important in our culture to give respect to the elder.
How would you communicate to someone older than you in your culture?
Just the same as like American people would refer to someone older than them. We don't use ma'am and sir, but maybe like Mr. and Mrs.
How would you communicate with someone a different gender than you in your culture?
The exact same as American culture. Yeah.
What's something that you think is unique about communication and etiquette in your culture?
So the town that I'm from, we have our own dialect called Doric, and so it's like almost like our own language that like older generations use. And each like town in Scotland has its like own dialect. So for like an outsider, like an English person looking in, or like another like citizen of another country looking in, it's like quite different.
What are some things we do in America that would be offensive in your culture? What makes them offensive?
So one thing is like, to me, and like definitely my parents have noticed it and my family have noticed it, is like Americans like aren't very direct and like they don't say what they mean. And so if like in the UK, be like, you were to say, oh, I'd like, if you just met someone, you'd be like, oh, I'll call you later, and like they never do, then a British person or a Scottish person would like take great offense to that. But that seems to be very common in America, I've noticed.